thy son's command.
Well, that wasn't right. Not even a little bit. The Canadian Football League at one point expanded into the United States. It's a fairly silly little short story. Not surprising, as it was a silly little short idea in the first place. But there was some hopes and aspirations associated with it. The NFL was getting to the height of its popularity at the time, and the CFL saw dollar signs. After a long slump of being the third most popular sport in America after baseball and basketball, and fighting or merging with all the other rival leagues, the NFL was finally able to take in massive viewership numbers in the 90s. The CFL, however, was in dire straits. Much like the NFL prior to its meteoric rise, the CFL was quickly becoming insolvent. Something had to be done. Something that almost 20 years earlier caused such outrage that the Canadian government would get involved. This is the story of the CFL's wacky expansion into the United States, and a quick history of both leagues. American and Canadian football shared the same roots: British rugby. The two countries took the original sport, tweaked the rules and regulations, and started calling it football, although the name rugby football would stick around for a while. These would be known as the Burnside Rules in Canada and Walter Camp's American Code in the United States. The Canadians were the first to professionalize the sport after the formation of the Interprovincial Rugby Football Union in 1907 and the Western Interprovincial Football Union in 1936. The NFL would form in 1920, although be mostly unrecognizable by fans today. Both leagues were neck and neck in popularity at the time, and while the Canadians would mostly stick to the Burnside rules, the Americans would further develop the sport, evolving the rules just as recently as 2021. Due to their similarity in proximity, American and Canadian players would hop the border and play in either league, as both offered similar pay and opportunities. The 1936 Winnipeg Blue Bombers would be the first Canadian team to start drafting in large numbers of Americans, and when the league found out, they were none too happy. They wanted to keep it as Canadian as possible and develop talent north of the border. So a ruling went out limiting the amount of players from the United States, a rule which still stands today and has changed very little. The segregation of the leagues wouldn't really affect either one. Football in the United States and Canada was still a fairly unpopular sport. However, this would change in Canada, as the merging of the two leagues that formed the CFL would form, well, the CFL. I've been using that term despite the fact that before 1958, the Canadian Football League didn't really exist. The IRFU and the WIFU would become, respectively, the Eastern and Western division of the Canadian Football League. Post-merger, the CFL would see a marked uptick in viewership, even hosting royalty semi-regularly. Likewise, in the United States, the NFL would merge with its rival, the American Football League, in 1966, and host the first Super Bowl in 1967 between the two best teams of either league, the NFL's Green Bay Packers and the AFL's Kansas City Chiefs. The merger would skyrocket the league into the stratosphere in terms of popularity, so much so that its influence was felt north of the border. There were rumors that the NFL was going to use its newfound clout to expand into Canada, ending the CFL's monopoly. This terrified the Canadians. No longer were they on equal footing with their American counterparts. So in 1972, a plan was hatched by a conglomerate of New York businessmen helmed by real estate magnate Robert E. Schmertz. He was no stranger to professional sport. He eventually owned the Portland Trail Blazers and Boston Celtics of the NBA, the New England Whalers of the WHA, the World Hockey Association, and the New York Stars of the World Football League. Remember the WFL. They will return to this story. He approached the CFL to see if they wanted to host a team south of the 49th parallel, in New York City. The team would play in Yankee Stadium, and Schmertz thought they had a shot at being more popular than the New York Giants. Sam Berger, the owner of the floundering Montreal Alouettes, was keen on selling him the team, and the Toronto Argonauts owner John Bassett was excited to the possibility. The equalization payments the Argos were giving to these smaller teams across Canada was hurting his bottom line. That's right, the CFL has equalization payments, where more profitable teams will give to have-not teams in order to keep the league even. Everything was in place. All Schmertz needed was approval from the CFL Board of Owners. Unfortunately for him, patriotism beat out cash, and his bid was rejected. The main cause of the rejection was worry that this would Americanize the sport. Although disappointed, John Bassett would be satiated after a meeting with the Canadian government. They promised to help the league stay solvent, and Berger would eventually sell the Alouettes to Nelson Skalbania in 1981. After the World Football League's creation, people questioned the name. It consisted only of American teams from mostly smaller markets that the NFL wouldn't touch. That was until 1974 when John Bassett Jr., son of Argonauts owner John Bassett, go figure, requested an expansion into Toronto. They even had a stadium for them to play at. Exhibition Stadium, home of his father's team, so the Argonauts and the future Toronto WFL team would play in the same stadium. They poached a few key players from the Miami Dolphins on multi-million-dollar salaries. They got the city hyped up and pressed forward with the 1975 season opener. However, the Canadian government would make sure that that season opener would never come. Health Minister for then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau would table legislation to stop any American league from furthering competition with the CFL. Trudeau wanted to take it a step further. He considered banning TV from showing NFL games altogether. Bassett would fight the government's proposal, but was forced to give in before things got legislated into law. The Toronto Northman WFL team would be turned around and sold to Memphis as the Southmen. Yeah, real creative name. John Bassett Jr. would try one more time to bring American football to Canada. The US Football League would pop up in 1982 and last until 1986. During their inaugural 1983 season, Bassett proposed a 4-team expansion into Vancouver, Edmonton, Montreal, and Toronto. When they asked about the Canadian Football Act being resurrected, he was as defiant as ever, thinking that this time he would beat the government. However, football was at an all-time low in terms of viewership in Canada, and the plan was dropped for being a pretty bad financial decision. I feel like I should mention that the Toronto Phantoms of the American Arena Football League did end up playing in Canada for 2 seasons, and weirdly enough, the World League of American Football, a European football offshoot of the NFL, did host a Montreal team called the Machine that played for a season. So they found a way eventually. But if you don't count those outliers, this would be the last time the Americans tried to enter the Canadian football market. It was clear after 2 failed attempts that Canadian patriotism wasn't to be trifled with, and the league was protected by the government at all costs. And costs were for sure incurred. The CFL went into a slump thanks to the oversaturation of the sport by the NFL and the WFL. Without government funds propping up some of the franchises, survival chances were fairly slim. Drastic changes needed to be made. Well, if the Americans couldn't come to Canada, then the CFL would go south and show them what they were missing. The WFL would fold midway through the disastrous 1975 season, leaving the NFL with only 2 rivals during the 80s, the USFL and the CFL. The XFL would show up as a 3rd rival in 1999, but ultimately fold 2 years later. Speaking of the 90s, it was also a really bad time for the CFL. The Alouettes would fold in 1987 before the regular season started. The Calgary Stampeders, Saskatchewan Roughriders, Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and BC Lions weren't in much better shape. The ever-profitable Toronto Argonauts that were expected to keep the have-not teams afloat were themselves not turning much of a profit thanks to owner infighting. John Candy, Wayne Gretzky, and Bruce McNall apparently had lots of beef with each other. The only CFL team with actual positive attendance and revenue turned out to be the Edmonton Eskimos, and they couldn't balance anyone's books. The NFL had been gaining steam on Canadian TV and was outpacing the salaries of the average CFL player by 7 or 8 times. That means less players to pick up and less ability to market to the potential ticket holders. Some quick changes needed to be made to keep the league afloat, and then Commissioner Larry Smith pushed for an expansion into smaller American markets that the NFL were neglecting. As I mentioned in my Bill Hunter documentary, by the 90s, the entry fee for a sports franchise in the top 4 big leagues, the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, and the MLB, had risen to astronomical costs. This was no longer a fun pastime for a mildly rich businessman. This was a $7 to mid-8-figure deal that came with huge costs and responsibilities. So for an established league to come in and say, hey, if you want to own your own team in the majors, all you got to do is give us $2 million and it's yours. That was a crazy good deal. In 1992, the CFL would host a few exhibition games in potential expansion cities, but only one took the bait, and in 1993, the Sacramento Gold Miners would be the first American team in the CFL. They would come last in the West, but showed a lot of promise. The year after, the Shreveport Pirates, Baltimore CFLers, and Las Vegas Posse would join the league. Baltimore was initially called the Colts, but were sued by the NFL for trademark infringement, and Las Vegas was seen as a gamble by the NFL. They pegged it as a problem city due to the sports betting and low potential attendance. The 1994 season turned out to be quite the improvement in fortunes, seeing Baltimore go to the Grey Cup final, losing to the BC Lions 26-23, and bringing in new viewership that the CFL craved. Between 1993 and 1995, the CFL raked in $14.3 million from their franchise experiments. A small amount today, but at the time, a life-saving cash injection. However, not everything was looking so great. Midway through the 94 season, it was clear that the NFL kinda knew what they were talking about regarding Las Vegas. The attendance records of Posse games were abysmal, and they still have one of the worst CFL records in the history of the league. Things got so bad that the team stopped playing in their arena and moved to Edmonton to play for their last game, meaning Edmonton was host to two CFL teams at the same time. They couldn't adjust to the culture of the league. A lounge singer named Dennis Casey Park massacred the Canadian anthem so bad that the Posse had to send a letter of apology to then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He would get a second chance to sing the anthem properly thanks to the Hamilton Ticats. He aced it the second time. The last game played in their Las Vegas arena brought just over 2,000 fans, roughly half of those being from the away team, Winnipeg. The Posse was eventually folded and they were shopped around to Milwaukee, Jackson, and Miami. Miami was the only city that took the bid seriously, mocking up a logo and a name, the Miami Manatees. I adore this logo. Look at that little guy, he just wants to play some football. Sadly, the deal never materialized and Las Vegas dissolved quietly. The Shreveport Pirates had to share their arena with a circus. The players would get spitted and pissed on by monkeys while they were practicing, and the smell of wild animal scat in the Louisiana heat made fans and players nauseous. Believe it or not, the Pirates actually hold a few CFL records. The fastest firing of any head coach, the longest consecutive losing streak, 0-14, and the most rain delays of any CFL team. The owner, Bernard Lieberman, started becoming infamous around the league when he defaulted on his debt to the city of Shreveport. The city councilors tried to take his 1948 Tucker sedan as collateral, a car that he loaned from a local museum. Bernard had different plans and sped away from the repo man. A police chase ensued and the car was recovered undamaged and eventually returned to the museum. He would return to the CFL in 2005 to start up the Ottawa Renegades. They themselves were suspended in 2006 due to financial instability and folded in 2008, ending his career within the CFL. The Sacramento Gold Miners didn't have a stadium, period. They used Hornet Stadium, which was a glorified track and field meet. It didn't have any indoor facilities, which meant that the only washrooms were porta potties, and the spectator stands were only temporary scaffolding. When the owner approached the city to upgrade the field, they declined, and the Gold Miners would be moved to San Antonio for the 1995 season as the San Antonio Texans. The Texans were the southmost CFL team, leading to long bus rides and flights. The CFL wasn't equalizing payments to American teams, so the Texans were spending thousands just getting their team to play away games. The CFL board would eventually alleviate the travel by switching the divisions from east to west to north to south, which worked in the short term. Thankfully, the Texans had an incredibly passionate owner that was committed to seeing this CFL experiment through. They would be the last American team to fold, being quite profitable for the year they actually played. The move from Sacramento to San Antonio is one of only 2 times a CFL team has ever been relocated, and the other time was much more successful. The Birmingham Barracudas are a late addition to the experiment. They joined for the 1995 season and did fairly well, making the playoffs but losing in the divisional semi-finals. The team seemed to have a future, but the ownership didn't like the CFL management. They put forth suggestions to make the game more appealing to an American audience. First, reduce the size of the field to be in line with the NFL's 100 yards instead of the CFL's 110 yards. Second, reduce the players on the field to 11 instead of 12, just like the NFL. And finally, change the league's name to sound something more American, like the NFL. So basically just make the NFL again, but this time cheaper. The cherry on top was to move the season to spring start instead of summer start. The CFL told them to pack their bags and leave. Nothing was going to change. The Memphis Mad Dogs were another late addition, joining the league with the Barracudas in 1995. The founder of FedEx ponied up the dough to get the team running. He had had a few failed bids to bring the NFL to Memphis, including one with Elvis as a potential owner, both dead and alive. When he approached the CFL, they were shocked. This was the most money they had ever seen from an owner, and they were considering selling him an existing team just to get him off on a good foot. That never happened, and the Mad Dogs faded into obscurity like all the other American teams. Head coach Pepper Rogers hated CFL management as well. He didn't think the CFL's advertising hook, longer, faster, wider, was suitable for American palates. Turns out he was right. Baltimore got off to a rocky start. As I mentioned, the whole Colts name debacle wasn't great, but it didn't sink their ship. They would go on to bandy about names like the aforementioned CFLers and Baltimore Football Club. They finally settled with the horse theme, rebranding themselves to the Stallions. Maybe a rocky start was too harsh, as the fans were absolutely excellent from day one. The anti-NFL sentiment was strong in the city after they moved the original Baltimore Colts to Indianapolis, and then snubbed them in the '93 expansion draft. The owner Jim Sparrows was smart and made sure to recruit Canadian coaches and talent, which ended up paying dividends. They were easily the best team to come out of the expansion, eventually being one of the best teams in the league. They would go to the Grey Cup final in '94, and do something that I don't think CFL management thought was even possible. They would win the Grey Cup in '95. Yeah, you heard that right. An American team that was only 2 years old ended up taking home the very Canadian Grey Cup. All the rhetoric about patriotism and protecting the game and legislating everything was all now moot. The naysayers and worrywarts were correct. This might have been a bad move. To be blunt, Canadians were pissed. Really pissed, while Americans seemed mostly ambivalent, probably because they were being distracted by the movements of the NFL. The CFL once again proved that smaller markets could actually work. So the owner of the Cleveland Browns saw the success of the Stallions in Baltimore and said, hey, let's pick up shop and move there. The whole debacle was so ubiquitous that it's still just called the move. The controversy this started still holds ire to this day, with the newly formed Cleveland Browns being bitter rivals with the modern-day Baltimore Ravens. But back to the CFL, I'm digressing. The Grey Cup win was completely overshadowed by the move controversy, and with the NFL in town, Baltimore had now become a battle site between the two leagues. The CFL knew it couldn't compete financially or culturally. The last three willing teams, the Stallions, the Texans, and the Pirates, would all shut down. Previously, I had mentioned that the Texans were one of two relocated teams in the CFL's long history. The Stallions are the only other. They had fans, they had cash, and management was eager to keep playing. So the team would be relocated to Montreal to start up the third and current iteration of the Alouettes, being incredibly successful. When all was said and done, the CFL was better off. They had tried and lost, but also saved the league from destruction. They gained a few thousand fans in the States, even getting a shout out on Seinfeld as Kramer's preferred style of football. See Season 6, Episode 12, The Label Maker. To most Americans, the CFL was, and probably still is, seen as a minor league thing. Ken Rosenthal, a reporter from the Baltimore Sun after their Grey Cup win, said this: "A country that already suffers from an inferiority complex is going to require nationwide psychiatric assistance now that a US team, a potentially homeless US team, has won the Grey Cup for the first time." In response, I'll direct him to the Toronto Blue Jays taking back-to-back World Series in '92 and '93. I'm sure that stung to many blue-blooded Americans. So where's the CFL now? Still not great. It isn't in the worst shape, but every recession brings new challenges. My preferred team, the Edmonton Elks, are a long way from their glory days, but no one in the league is worried about folding. In terms of future expansions, there are always talks about adding a 10th team. Many exhibition games have been played in Atlantic Canada, so that would most likely be the site of the new expansion. It's a decision of what province should host and who's going to pony up the money. The Atlantic Schooners would be a much-needed addition to the league. A second American expansion has also been speculated, but that's more of a dream than a reality. The territories would be an interesting choice, but maintenance would become difficult if the season runs long, and the sparse population would become an issue. I'm making a prediction, and I want you to make one as well, so please let me know in the comments where and when you think the CFL will expand. I'm gonna go with Halifax, or a second team in Saskatchewan or BC, sometime in 2025 to, I don't know, let's say 2029. Thank you for watching.